Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Charles Waldheim, and it's my pleasure to serve as the Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture and Director of the Office for Urbanization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Welcome to the second installment in our new series, Cape Ann Conversations. We began the series last month with a very stimulating conversation with Dr. Carrie Emanuel from MIT on the topic of modeling hurricane impacts. The series will continue this fall with conversations on disaster preparation and how we talk about climate adaptation. The Cape Ann Conversations are a series hosted by our research group, the Office for Urbanization, and these convenings form a portion of our ongoing multi-year adaptation research project developed in collaboration with the Cape Ann Climate Coalition, TownGreen, and the Water Alliance. And we're very pleased to be supported in that work and joined today by Valerie Nelson of the Water Alliance, herself a Harvard alum, Dick Prouty of TownGreen, Greg Federspiel of Manchester by the Sea, and my colleague, Kira Klingon, who's a research associate and lecturer at the Harvard GSD. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all. Thanks for spending some time with us this afternoon, and to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jesse Keenan. Jesse Keenan is the Favrot Associate Professor of Sustainable Real Estate in the School of Architecture at Tulane University. A globally recognized thought leader, Keenan is a leading voice at the intersection of climate change, adaptation, the built environment across many disciplines, including design, engineering, planning, policy, and the conversation for today, climate finance. Keenan has advised on these matters for agencies of the US government, for governors, mayors, Fortune 500 companies, community enterprises, and international NGOs, among others. He has a distinguished teaching and research record, having taught and pursued research at Harvard University, at Columbia, having served as visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, among other appointments. He's currently elected honorary research associate in sustainable finance at Oxford University, among many other acknowledgements and honors. Keenan is co-author of NYC 2040, Housing the Next Million New Yorkers, as well as Climate Adaptation Finance and Investment in California. And he's also co-editor of Blue Dunes, Climate Change by Design, a volume that's essential reading in our circles, as well as North American Climate Adaptation, Fostering Resilience, and a Regional Capacity to Adapt. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Jesse. Thank you so much for doing this. We know that you're in great demand for these things, and the thing to say is we can't afford your day rate, but welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's a great privilege to be here. I'll preface my talk today that I've been quite unwell and in and out of the hospital. In fact, I'll be returning here within a few hours. So if I'm a little off the mark and not up to speed as I generally may be, you'll have to forgive me. And in fact, if I make it through the next hour, I will feel rather accomplished. Today's talk is on a rather benign conversation or defined conversation associated with financing climate adaptation. But maybe a better talk, or a better title rather, is Wake Up Massachusetts, You're Already Paying for Climate Change. And perhaps a slightly more refined title might be There's Still Time to Go to the ER and Stop the Bleeding. And yet even a more refined, because I've had a medical state of mind lately, except there's no federally sponsored ER, and you're going to have to stitch this up at home with a CVS at-home kit. So this is the state of our underlying pathology of climate in Massachusetts and coastal Massachusetts, specifically Cape Ann. And I want to have that degree of urgency, because we really are bleeding out in terms of municipal finance and public finance. And while this is a graphic title, it's intended to offer to the matter. When I first started working on climate change and real estate in the built environment, people told me that I was crazy, until I had some pretty profound empirical evidence, or maybe not so profound, but some robust empirical evidence that suggested that behaviors are changing, markets are responding, signals do exist. After one of my papers, this was published in Miami Herald, one of my papers in Miami, this was published in the Miami Herald with the denier and property values. I think I always love this cartoon. But let's talk about the big picture in the context of where we are in coastal Massachusetts and really all across the United States. Big picture. The economic scale of adaptation is really beyond the capacity of the public sector, right? The cost that we face in the next 77 years, an average lifespan in the United States leading to the end of the century, are way beyond anything we could possibly afford to fund and finance. And I say we in the grand public scheme of things. At this moment, the United States does not have a national adaptation plan, despite our obligation to do so under the Paris Accord. All of the G20 countries, we're the only G20 country without a national adaptation plan. The collective strategy on adaptation at the White House and the federal government is nowhere as comprehensive as you might think it is. It's very ad hoc, largely driven around disaster response, recovery, pre-hazard mitigation, some measures of infrastructural resilience and the like. There is no national plan. The major focus has been on climate mitigation. We all recognize this with the IRA and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, but more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's about decarbonizing our economy through incentives as opposed to taxes, right? So we're going to spend lots of money on incentivizing mitigation. But incentives also exist for adaptation. And just to reorient ourselves to the language here, adaptation is preparing for and responding to the impacts of climate change. That's what brings us here today. So incentives do exist, but these incentives originate in the private sector, not necessarily in the public sector. So it's a completely different orientation. What's the implications of that? The rich are going to adapt. That means rich counties, municipalities, rich people, wealthy companies, those with accumulated capital adapt. And we risk maladaptation for everyone else. And this is a fundamental problem economically. The question is, who pays for climate change? Everyone pays for climate change in a lot of different ways. But don't take my word for it. Take two definitive publications of the US government, Managing Climate Risk in the US Financial System, of which I was one of the elected editors, published by the first major climate publication, it was actually just the first climate publication really by a US financial regulator. And more recently, just a few weeks ago, the Economic Report of the President, published by the Council of Economic Advisors. Now, the Council of Economic Advisors are the leading economists in the United States, often academics, who serve in the White House and help guide our economic understanding. This is a really definitive and authoritative source of economics. Let me read some passages for us to understand. Again, this just came out. The design of climate adaptation policies must recognize that actors across the United States, including individuals and businesses, all levels of government, already face incentives to adapt, but they also face informational and financial legal constraints that limit their ability to adapt. So there's barriers. We understand that. Recent research has suggested that both the risks of sea level rise and the productivity effects of things like extreme heat are already reflected in property and agricultural land prices. So we're going to talk about property today as the basis and unit of the economic system of local finance. But climate risk premiums are also showing up in longer-term corporate and municipal bonds. Again, municipal bonds central to our orientation of our capacity to adapt in the future, i.e. pay for things. Now, this is important. Effective adaptation policy will recognize that individuals, households, business communities will respond to the shifting climate. But these actions will be defined by legal, informational, financial constraints. They mention that, along with sometimes distorted or perverse incentives that these actors face. And here's the spoiler alert later on in this publication. The federal, state, and local governments, particularly the federal governments, already create quite perverse incentives that are maladaptive. The National Flood Insurance Program allows people to build in very high-risk areas with little consequences for repetitive loss. Zoning and property taxes and the developmental paradox that we have to grow our way out of a high-risk situation. Or even something as simple as building new bridges with a useful life of 100 years to an island that will be gone in 50 years. Right? These are not hypotheticals, these are fundamental problems. But this is where it really gets good. Government action, quote, government action that targets constraints and market failures that impede adaptation should be most effective in supporting and enabling private action rather than, this is really important, rather than crowding out actions that would have occurred anyway. This is a classic economic position. Translation, you are on your own. Good luck, right? The government is not going to crowd out adaptation investments that would have otherwise happened at the household level, the local government, various financial stakeholders, investors. You're on your own. Good luck. This is what this fundamentally translates to. So this is where we began our conversation. You're on your own. So how does any of this relate to coastal Massachusetts? Aren't these just macro effects, right? Isn't it just about a function of GDP? And it's not really going to relate to us on the ground, will it? Buried during the height of the COVID epidemic in March of 2020 was a paper that came out by Linda Sheehan, I think it's Andrew Veruzzo. And they looked at the percentage of municipal budgets impacted within a 6-foot sea level rise zone. And if you look closer to Cape Ann area, you see a fairly sizable impact. Now, this is your interest spread. This is more than enough at risk in terms of municipal budget to speak to the interest spread, or interest cost rather, of any kind of public financing. And in fact, when you look at where this tax base, at risk tax base is from, is disproportionately from residential properties, as one might imagine, although that's not entirely true. I think that's in Beverly. So this is still a very conservative estimate, 5 to 10% of municipal budgets at risk. Why is it a conservative estimate? First, it measures chronic inundation, and it does not measure what we call effective economic inundation. So they're basically just kind of assuming the property's underwater. But effective economic inundation actually occurs. That is, the market treats a piece of property as effectively inundated at the point in the time that it reaches something like 20 flood days a year, which actually comes much sooner than later, right? You don't need a property to be completely underwater. Just get intermittent flooding days that happen, and it will have huge loss in value. We know this from various behavioral economic experiments and some observation. It does not account for intervening adaptation costs, right? So as sea levels rise, storms increase, we have extreme precipitation and the like, we're going to have intervening costs, right? That will further erode the net orientation, right? We're looking at gross income, but if we think of the outflow of money, we net that out, it's not accounting for adaptation costs, particularly as we seek to have very high cost infrastructural investments that protect a relatively limited number of, let's say, politically savvy, wealthy homeowners. It does not account for declining values in infrastructurally dependent areas. And what does that mean? It means that properties will devalue, even if they're on high ground, if they are often served by, let's say, a main road that floods, or infrastructure that is flooding or is inundated. So this is just looking at absolute inundation. It's not accounting for this gross unevenness. And in fact, this has been well observed already, that properties that may be on high ground, again, you have to drive to school, drive to work, and if you can't quite get there because of intervening flooding, it actually has a value in your property. And it does not account for the price adjustments between low and high risk areas. We're going to come back to that, some research that just came out last week. So there's a lot. This is a very conservative number. And in fact, if you were to think this through a little bit more concretely, 20 to 30% of revenue could certainly be at risk as a value proposition. But one of their conclusions is that you have time now, right? You have time in terms of land use, in terms of comprehensive planning, et cetera, et cetera. But what they found is that the costs above 3 feet, and we're approaching the 3 feet mark quite rapidly here in coastal Louisiana, are like 10 or 11 millimeters of sea level rise per year, which is an enormous rate, well above things. I would imagine up there, I don't know where you are, I should have looked this up, much lower rate, but it's coming, and it's coming faster than many people have acknowledged. But that's not the point. The point is that costs above 3 feet will come faster than many can keep up towards the end of the century. So when it comes, it hits very fast, right? You don't have a lot of lag time once you hit this threshold that they determined at about 3 feet. So this is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night in terms of the property tax base, people's value, their wealth that is caught up in these properties, and what this means culturally, institutionally, and financially and politically on so many levels. But let's begin, since this is a conversation among public stakeholders as it is private stakeholders, and start by acknowledging that the muni bond market is beginning to price climate risk. Let me just say this one more time. The muni bond market is beginning to price climate risk. So what's happening? Municipal bond disclosures are increasingly under the microscope for disclosing, participating in things like TCFD, Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, for both physical and transition risk, right? Credit rating agencies have done something rather interesting. They've acquired lots of climate services firms that measure exposure and sensitivity of assets and translate that into an orientation associated with credit ratings. And then they sell those into the market. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. They, among other financial services stakeholders, are putting huge amounts of money, what I call the climate intelligence arms race, into understanding how climate impacts, particularly physical impacts associated with assets. And so credit rating agencies in particular, which are very important, are beginning to internalize whether you have a plan and how exposed are you, particularly within the term of the bond or the bond call. Now, physical and transition risks are widely considered material risks. That is, they're important. You have to disclose them. And there's been some recent examples of this, particularly in California and Oregon, where forest fires have burned down a large percentage of a tax base. In fact, there's insurance products that cover this now, rather novel ways. But one of the first examples of this that came to my mind, and this was a number of years ago, almost 10 years ago, was I was talking to a bond trader on Wall Street. I was like, hey, is climate on the picture? Are you thinking about climate? And they were like, yes and no. They don't, most bonds get purchased very quickly. There's not a lot of due diligence. There's the bond counsel's letter. They kind of make sure everything's in order. Most bonds get bought up by a few large institutional purchasers who essentially index it, right? The market moves pretty fast. And so one bond buyer was telling me, he's like, I don't have a lot of time. But the Key West, and a lot of times climate's not on the picture, but he's like, you know what? The Key West Aqueduct Authority was floating I think it was like a 30-year bond or something, 20, 30-year bond. And, he's like, in my head, it was like, in 30 years, because I've been to Key West, I'm sort of paraphrasing here. He was like, I don't know if this is going to be a good investment, right? It's so low lying. If you've ever been in around the Navy base, the Air Reserve base, Key West, it's an extremely low-lying area. And he's like, well, I had like 10 minutes to make a decision. So I pulled up, this is the bond buyer. He's like, I pulled up, NOAA sea level rise viewer, very, it's a consumer-based tool. They update it. It's very useful. He just, put in the web address, pulled it up, looked at the bond lettering offer where the facilities were, looked at it on the web and was like, you know what? I'm going to pass. And when one of the major institutional purchasers passes, that actually has an effect, because now you have smaller people who are essentially bidding on this, and that bids up the yield, right? So that means when a big buyer passes on a bond like this, it's essentially going to have more, generally, this isn't always the case, by implication, there would generally be higher borrowing costs because of that. And that really opened my mind that maybe something was more substantively engaged here. So as we have more analytical capacity that mostly focuses on the exposure of assets and not necessarily the sensitivity or the risk management plans, we're mostly at this point looking at exposure, just like, will something be impacted, not necessarily how it will react. But as we move forward, that's going to change, because increasingly municipalities are going to need structural plans and capital allocations to manage risk much sooner than later. We already know that the credit rating agencies and others are out there having a conversation with municipalities, and it's maturing quite fast. Now I want to return for a second to the side note of a climate intelligence arms race. And this is a rapid proliferation of climate services and technologies supporting private sector, essentially information arbitrage, right? Trying to guess how exposed one asset may be versus the other, betting for and against it. Like everything in financial services, just moving money around. And it's rapidly increased with venture capital and huge acquisitions of firms and intellectual property from consultancies, credit rating agencies, and the like. In full conflict of interest, I'm an advisor to Jupiter Intelligence, Climate Check, and Forerunner, which are major firms within this sphere. We have significant market share. But there's a tension here between proprietary intellectual property and public transparency. And the problem is that in the private sector, they have some counterparty sophistication for the value of these services and the validation of the applied science. Public consumers really do not, right? They don't necessarily have that counterparty service, sophistication. And this has raised a broader question is the applied science even valid? Because we know there's some junk applied science out there that's not really good. It's not fit for purpose. It's being misapplied. And so what we have is a kind of bifurcation of classes of climate data. We have the haves and the have-not, right? And the public data is increasingly not as well invested in or curated as is some of what's happening in the private sector. Let's return to bonds for a second. This is a table from now a seminal work by Painter in 2020 in a paper called The Inconvenient Cost, the Effects of Climate Change on Municipal Bonds. And here we're looking at mean annual loss and a percentage, what they call climate risk, or it's a percentage of annual loss of the city's GDP. You can see New Orleans here is 1.47% every year of GDP that's at risk. Boston's actually pretty high up here. It's just after Tampa, Virginia, Miami. These are very large numbers, and this is the way we've begun to orient climate risk as a function of GDP. This is a very rough estimate, by the way. And what Painter found is that there's a 23.4 basis point increase in annualized cost for every 1% increase in climate risk. So an average bond at about $27.5 million would mean a total annualized increased borrowing cost of about $64,000. It's not a lot of money, but it's also a lot of money, right? That's money that could have gone somewhere else or something else. When we think about that over time and the time value of money, it's important. And by the way, climate risks and climate premiums are only going up. They're not going down, particularly as we have better information. Interestingly enough, in this paper, they found the increased spread, that is an increased responsiveness of a climate signal in the bond market when the Stern Review came out. And you probably wouldn't know what the Stern Review is, but it was considered, came out of the UK. I think it was published by the Majesty's Exchequer of the Currency or whatever it is, the equivalent of the Treasury Department in the UK. The massive publication, 1,000 pages or something. And it was all about how climate change was shaping the global economy. And when that came out, bond market actually paid attention to that. And they found a correlation in the timing of that, which is quite unique because we do see with increased information that markets do respond. We'll look at this in more detail in a minute. So let's return to climate change in real estate and housing and the like, particularly here in the context of coastal Massachusetts. We have some risks: devalued assets, declining property tax rolls, uninsured losses, and regional declines in economic output, right? Loss in localized GDP, which has, by the way, huge implications for an already stressed commercial office market. There'll also be opportunities. People will be on the move. They're going to need new real estate, they need new housing. And of course, as I mentioned, there's information arbitrage. We try to estimate where things are and are not exposed, and we try to understand where value is and isn't. So let's look at some of the literature. What does economics literature tell us about all of this, right? Let's move from sort of the projections and the conjecture or the early stage research to more refined empirical observations. Risk and risk reduction capitalization, that is when a piece of property or an asset reflects the risk, the price reflects the risk, is often long observed in a non-climatic sense. So if you just live in a flood zone or area that floods, the properties will decline in value because of that. If you build a flood wall, they will go up because of that. But those effects are usually not particularly, well, they're robust, but they have a declining robustness. They're kind of short-lived. People's memory is not so long, if you will. So keep that in the back of your mind. Bernstein et al. In a very important paper in 2019 found that coastal properties within a sea level rise zone, I think a 6-foot sea level rise zone, sold at a 7% discount relative to other similarly situated properties all across the United States. So we know if you're in a sea level rise zone, there is a discounting. That is, buyers and sellers are discounting because of that. And it was actually much stronger price effects, I think upwards of a 12 to 15% for multifamily assets, because these are primarily investors, and investors are much more savvy about exposure and risk. And so they were discounting more heavily, right? As an investor, you in theory should be more sophisticated in understanding exposure costs, insurance costs, it's likely, and the like. So you're going to discount more heavily. They found that price effects extend not just to homes that are directly exposed, as I previously mentioned, but also neighborhoods that depend on roads and infrastructure that are exposed. So again, it doesn't necessarily just apply to those homes that are being inundated or economically inundated, effectively economically inundated. And what we see because of this, or incidental to this, I wouldn't say because of it, but incidental, is we do now see a bit of a geographic concentration of risk premiums in the RMBS market, residential mortgage-backed securities. So mortgages get pooled into these big securities, they get sold off to Fannie and Freddie and beyond. And credit rating agencies look at the geographic concentration. So if you have a bunch in Florida or coastal Carolina or something, they will add a risk premium essentially to that. But there is some anticipation through the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which regulates Fannie and Freddie, which are about 50% of the American housing and mortgage market, that we will increasingly have an infrastructural scale system for determination of climate risk. And therefore, we're going to start seeing more climate risk premiums played out in how we price and deliver the terms of mortgages, or the delivery mortgages, if at all. So let's continue on with let's say the demand side, or consumer behavior. Flood risk information accessibility does increase risk capitalization in housing. So the more aware people are that there's a risk, the more likely it is that you will discount. Homeowners that are more likely are becoming more and more aware of sea level risks over time. And as they become more aware, they discount accordingly, right? So the more aware that you are, but North Carolina is an unbelievable story about this. It kind of flipped within just a couple of years in terms of people's belief systems, and the property valuations changed accordingly. Primary and non-primary homeowners discount climate risk differently, in the sense that whether you live there or you don't live there, and if it's a second home or vacation home, you have a different orientation to risk, so your discounting is different. In sea level rise zones with very strong beliefs, that is, with your neighbors around you have strong beliefs in climate change, there is less housing construction compared to more skeptical areas. So if you and your neighbors are really worried about sea level rise, it turns out that politically, in terms of zoning and planning and permitting, you just have less housing construction. Where there's more frequent storm events leads to discounting in high-risk areas and increased value in low-risk areas. Right? So we see a shift in the valuation where capital is moving from high-risk to low-risk areas, something I published on a number of years ago. Distant and local hurricanes, and this is like under the label of people are crazy, and the kind of irrationality of all of this. Distant local hurricanes do have an impact. So if you have a big storm that wipes out the islands and Bahamas, it actually does have a short-lived impact on Florida, in places in Florida, and particularly in high-risk waterfront properties. But these are very short-lived effects, like one year, 2 years or something, and then people forget about it. Coastal land use policies. So in jurisdictions, it has been observed where they are signaling that they're going to have future adaptation requirements, right? They're planning, they've got sea level rise maps, they're going to rezone the whole thing. Guess what happens? People go out and build as much unregulated housing construction as they possibly can before the rules get into place. So as an unintended consequences of pushing adaptation measures locally is that it stimulates the market to get ahead of those regulations. That's particularly in the Carolinas. Houses projected to be underwater in climate believer neighborhoods sell at a discount compared to homes in climate denier neighborhoods. So again, this is really fundamentally important. What you and your neighbors think, and we have very good data on this, particularly from the Yale Climate Communications Center, all across the country for more than 20 years now. We know what neighborhoods believe in what generally. And by the way, this doesn't always correlate with political self-identification. It often most strongly correlates with level of education attainment, actually, among all things. It's not just Republicans and Democrats self-selecting into belief zones. It actually has a lot to do with education. And that's the power of why we need climate education, primary schools, high schools, and in universities. So climate deniers, they're not discounting as much in their housing market. Let's talk about forest fires. Forest fires are important. Proximity to forest fires does negatively impact values. There's strong price effects, particularly in urban areas. There's selection bias in the sense that the more fires you get, the stronger that discounting happens. When you give people information about forest fire risk, property by property, it actually shapes the market. Simply having a view of a forest fire area, even if your area wasn't even burned miles away, that lowers your property values, right? That's unbelievable if you think about the aesthetics of that in terms of landscape. Proximity to lower levels of forest density and vegetation have superior values. And the odd thing about this is that may not matter as much anymore, particularly with very large fires, where any kind of biomass or buffer zones are really deemed ineffective now, given the scale of fires. But yet markets have responded to public programming that suggests that we should remove vegetation in and around our homes as buffer zones. Now, the mortgage market and forest fires have had some responses too. The interesting thing is that the larger the forest fire, the decrease we have in the size or the amount of defaults and foreclosures, in the sense because the large fires are coordinated between the insurance companies and the mortgage companies to pay those off relatively quickly. A very counterintuitive finding. So the mortgage market, let's just talk macro terms now with the mortgage market, because people need mortgages to be able to live in housing and KFAN, et cetera, et cetera. What's the mortgage market worried about? They're worried about payment default, right? Your home burns down, you're no longer paying. But they're also really, really worried about prepayment risk. Because a lot of times, even if your house burns down or floods, you're going to pay off your mortgage with the insurance proceeds. And when you pay it off early, you don't get the investors in the mortgage bond don't get the full benefit of their interest payments, so their yields drop. This is a real concern, a fundamental concern. And what we found is that after big storms, particularly hurricanes, lenders tend to push borrowers into what they call into GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, into the public agencies, into conforming loan limit loans. So instead of, like, after hurricane hits, instead of you just going to the bank and the bank gives you a loan for a new house, they're saying, yeah, we'll give you a loan, but it's going to be a Fannie or Freddie loan. And what they're really doing is shifting that risk to the federal government. And this is a prime example of perverse government incentives that are maladaptive. And in fact, Amin Ozad and Matthew Kahn simulated the withdrawal of the GSEs in these high-risk areas. And you see down here in the green, the black is kind of the volume or probability of the acceptance of a mortgage. This is, essentially, you can just think of volume of the mortgage flow. And down here in the green is the simulation for what would happen if you remove the GSEs. So the federal government is deeply subsidizing and taking on an enormous amount of risk in the mortgage market. Now, this gets to my theory of underwater writing, sometimes called blue lighting from the consumer's point of view. And basically, we don't need to get into the theory of this, but it basically is outlining that there's a kind of true risk zone, and then there's an actionable risk zone. And there's a lot of, it's very rough. And the lenders don't always have perfect information. In fact, they have pretty poor models. There's a lot of institutional barriers and economic disincentives for them to really price climate risk at this point. We're going to leave that aside. What we wanted to do is evaluate a simple proposition. There's two types of lenders. In fact, there's lenders on a continuum. On one end of the continuum are major non-concentrated lenders, like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, right? They're all over the country. They're not concentrated in a particular area. Then we have concentrated lenders, small local community banks. They're concentrated in a particular area. And what we hypothesized was that local lenders with better soft information would disproportionately be selling off loans in sea level rise zones to the federal government and to the capital markets, to anybody, not keeping it on their books. And what we found was that the smaller the bank, the more concentrated you are, much more likely you would be selling mortgages off to the capital markets. In fact, when you look at the volume of loans originated and then collateralized by concentrated lenders, almost half of all the loans that they ship off to someone else to let it be someone else's problems are within 1 foot, 0.30 meters essentially of sea level rise zone. So the local banks, they have better information, may not necessarily, not everything's in a flood zone. Not everything is so formalized in terms of climate services technologies, but you know what? They drive by that particular lot every other day and they know it floods, right? They've got better soft information. If you're at a call processing center in Las Vegas for Bank of America, you don't have that soft information. So we've seen concentrated lenders in prior events like the foreclosure crisis. Concentrated lenders leading up to foreclosure crisis saw overvaluation of the housing market like 2 years before it happened and started to dry up the capital availability. We're seeing the exact same thing happen with climate change. In fact, this was cited in the president's report that just came out. There's also some emerging evidence come out just recently that there's a greater probability of loan application rejection in high-risk markets. And in high-risk markets where there's a strong belief in climate change, banks are tightening their credit standards. So again, what you and your neighbors think about climate change does matter. And prime mortgage lenders are tightening lending standards in post-disaster counties. So where you've just had a big investment or a big disaster, we're beginning to see lending standards tighten up. So the insurance market is also sending us some signals. In theory, mortgages should be pricing long-term risk. Insurance should be pricing essentially year-to-year risk. And the interaction between mortgages and insurance markets is rather interesting because in many ways, they share the same risk analytics ecosystem. So the projected increase for property insurance in Florida in 2023 is going to be about 40%. Here in Louisiana, probably closer to about 60% for the state insured. Louisiana, Texas, Carolinas, they're all right behind. The state insurers of last resort, right? What the state creates as a backstop when no one else will offer you insurance are really only as good as the credit worthiness of that particular state. In Florida, it's a big state, can handle it for the most part. Louisiana cannot. It does cloud the market with subsidies, right? This is a huge problem with the state insurer of last resort in Florida. It essentially so deeply subsidizes that the private market can't compete with the subsidized backstop of the state. And these impacts are not just wind, but they extend to property, flood, crop, and even car insurance. I remember the signals I was getting on car insurance availability in Florida a number of years ago were shocking, and the implications, particularly for working class Americans. So state markets, by the way, cross-subsidizes losses and yields, or market share, more or less. Yields are made not through market share, but how they invest the money. So we know that when you have a big loss in California, that essentially ratepayers in Idaho pay for it. So as we have more and more insurance losses, Massachusetts ratepayers are paying for it. You may not realize this, but they are. And interestingly enough, in Massachusetts, there's been a lot of consolidation of small insurance companies in Massachusetts recently, in the past couple of years. And what that tells me is that there's a lot of capital leaving high-risk states, and they're going to states like Massachusetts, which ostensibly have some risk, but the pricing elasticity hasn't been fully tapped or exposed. That is, they can keep charging you more and you're probably just going to keep paying it. And with fewer and fewer insurance companies, you're going to have less options. This is the strategy. This is how capital markets work. And interestingly enough, corresponding with that, there are new combined flood products that are being offered in Massachusetts, in the sense that you can buy essentially, instead of having separate premiums and deductibles, you can buy it in one package now through the private market. That's an innovation, but it also signals to me that there's going to be a huge crunch in Massachusetts because, well, they've got to make up for their losses elsewhere. So that was all about supply. What about demand? People moving to places like Cape Ann. 1 in 5 Americans, this is coming from Redfin, 1 in 5 Americans believe climate change is already impacting home values. Younger generations are more likely to say climate change is impacting home values in their area. City dwellers are more likely to say climate change is impacting their home. 1 in 5 homeowners have invested in protective measures for temperature and flooding. 35% of homeowners have spent at least $5,000 doing so. 45% of American households have seen insurance costs, and this was before, this is today is about essentially 2 years old, I believe. 49% of Americans who plan to move in the next year say natural disasters were a factor. About 9% of Americans move every year. That's mostly because of rental turnover. If 50% of those people, 9%, let's say 4.5% of Americans were moving because of natural disasters, I don't think that's necessarily true or the direct implication here, but let's say that was even remotely the case. We're talking about tens of millions of people. It's an enormous number. And by the way, Census Bureau doesn't have great numbers on this. And people like Matt Howard and others who are true demographers, I think, have been doing great work. And younger Americans are more likely to factor climate change into moving decisions, right? This is important, particularly for local economic development. 3/4 of Americans are hesitant to buy a home in areas with climate risk. 30% of people, this is terrible news for New Orleans, wouldn't move somewhere with rising sea levels, even if it were more affordable, right? That's a huge implication. Just last week, some research came out, published by a DDES graduate of the GSD, and looking at here at the coefficient of variables for in and out migration locally. And what they found is the frequency and intensity of flooding, as well as your elevation, is driving some measure of out migration as well as in migration. So we're seeing the movements of people locally responding to qualities like elevation and risk. These are not just, this is real observations across the East Coast of the United States. This is not just survey data. So let me conclude with some propositions. The first is that demand preferences, as we've just seen, are going to converge with supply costs and constraints to reorder housing, coastal housing infrastructure, and public finances, we know it, right? It's going to fundamentally change. But this is more of a problem for you. Slow-moving state and local governments are going to be outpaced by market and capital market behaviors, in the sense that we tend to think that democratic processes will dictate the terms from which we will adapt and determine distributional equity and procedural justice of the whole thing. But indeed, our decisions and the options that we have in the future are being determined today by essentially capital markets. So it's not up to us as much as we would like to think it is. So there are some public adaptation financing trends. There's revolving loan funds that are available increasingly from Washington and the federal government. And those do bring down the weighted average cost of our investments in infrastructure in some measure. There are green banks that are in theory coming out, and they're in the legislation, but the demand for mitigation investments in decarbonization far exceeds their credit capacity, will probably crowd out adaptation. There are still grants, but the federal cost share requirements aren't moving or changing anytime soon. We've seen huge inability of smaller jurisdictions to access this because they don't have, it's cost too much to administer it, more or less, and to even apply. And we've seen a lot of money sitting on the table. We haven't seen any substantive change in federal cost shares, nor do I think we will for a while. Federal grants for pre-hazard mitigation indeed can be catalytic. We've seen some of this in Massachusetts, but at the end of the day, the O&M costs, the operations maintenance costs, and the capital expenses are the costs of the local government, right? And that can be a real cost burden, particularly in terms of public finance. Private finance will concentrate adaptation among tax bases. So the capital out there that's going to go to adaptation, it's going to concentrate where the wealth and the economic activity is. And that can lead to tremendous amounts of, let's say, inequitable distribution and availability of capital. Now, the White House and the Office of Management Budget is attempting to rewrite the rules of benefit cost analysis to justify more widely distributed benefits. So when the government's figuring out where to invest, are there more net benefits over net costs? But at the end of the day, even if they were to fundamentally change that in a way that was more equitable to account for historical injustice, marginalization, just small jurisdictions that are just modest income households like Cape Ann, it's not fundamentally going to change much because there's just enough money out at the scale of what we're talking about. So let me indulge myself and you all with some final reflections on what I would say are post-climate housing real estate infrastructure. The imputed cost of infrastructure is such that they're impairing housing production. This is why we have more infill housing production, right? Infrastructure is just so expensive that we really can't build greenfield development like we used to, obviously. But those costs will be offset by the energy and occupancy cash flow generation. So the embodied of energy of assets will shift as they move into assets that are about energy storage and at the building and district scale. And so we will move from a two-dimensional orientation of value, square feet, to a four-dimensional value to account for energy, essentially in the volumetric condition spaces. So we're reshifting the orientation to space and place to something that is producing and storing energy, not its occupancy and utility value for pure occupancy. So we've learned through the Internet of Things to teach ourselves the language and shape ourselves. We've essentially been trained to use our homes and operate our homes essentially as factories for the consumption and now production of energy. And this means that as we move to front-end capital-intensive systems, that is, we all begin to buy essentially iPhone houses, we won't be able to afford the land costs, but we can essentially finance the capital costs of the machine of the home. And as we do that, that's going to shift from mortgage lending to essentially consumer lending. And it means that we are going to not have the same connections to the value of land as we used to, because that value of land will be determined by the productivity of that asset, the iPhone home, the machine, as an energy producer and store. And this is going to lead to huge measures of inequality, because essentially those first costs of the cost of an iPhone home are going to be so expensive that we won't be able to afford the land ultimately. There's a bunch of car companies right now are really interested into how cars plug into homes. We are on the verge of a massive revolution in how homes become energy infrastructure, but that's going to be more expensive for us. So the shift to consumer finance is good for upfront cash flows, but the downside is it doesn't lead to long-term tax efficient appreciations as we conventionally have had in American housing. This is an enormous challenge, opportunity, but also significant growth in inequality, economic inequality in this country. So the question is, can your town keep up with what the future holds? And I drop in these slides here from the Apple TV show, Extrapolations, episode 3, which is pretty heavily based, well, it is based, the plot line of episode 3 in Miami is based on my ideas and research over the years. One of the things I love about this is in one of these sort of iconic renderings from the TV show, you have something here zoned for loss, right? This idea that we've institutionalized loss. And I raise a question, and a concluding question, and thank you for having me, is you currently zoned for loss? And I would argue that indeed many of you are. So thank you very much for having me. I'm very glad that I made it through this in one piece, and good luck.
Thank you so very much, Jesse, for that, and especially when you haven't been feeling your best. We wish you the best and hope that you can hang on for a few questions.
Please.
We'll be opening the chat function, inviting people to raise their hands, but I'll start. Thank you for that really, characteristically, well-researched, authoritative and yet accessible, presentation of a series of dilemmas, a real series of challenges. You led with this notion that, of course, the wealthy individuals and institutions are already adapting. The people, individual actors are already, in a variety of ways, evidently making, changes, both in their, physical plants, but also in their kind of financial choices, in the time horizons and decision making that they're making, and that this is well out ahead of anything like democratic kind of governance. I know from your work on climate gentrification and from your remarks this afternoon that the notion of climate gentrification is something you've been quite central to developing a concept of. And from that, in your remarks this afternoon, I guess I could take away, but let me frame it as a question. Is it obvious in a case like Cape Ann that the pressure of climate change and as individuals and institutions are already adapting, that this will have a general tendency to increase economic inequality in the medium term.
Yeah, I think without being a localized expert, but with some peripheral understanding based on your research and the research of others in this project, I think it's fair to say that as we see local in and out migration in high risk areas and a revaluation of property, that those very low risk properties or areas that could be developed, particularly into housing and other amenity driven development, will be quite disruptive because there are concentrated patterns of historic development patterns where the infrastructure is relatively concentrated, and most of that is really immediately on the coast. And so the idea of moving inland when you have a lot of land conservation, you have a lot of sensitive hydrological and geographic attributes that make development prohibitive, it's going to be a tremendous conflict between affordable housing and development and measures of accessibility and conservation, environmental conservation, and exclusionists who often own very large tracts and estates in those interior properties. So I think we're setting ourselves up for an ethical dilemma about can we have sustainable urban development? Can we concentrate it? Can we concentrate that infrastructure accordingly? Or are we just going to have one-off housing subdivisions that are pretty isolated along state highways, and we try to put as much of the infrastructure burden on the state and others and take it off our back? So I think this is why zoning and land use and having a comp plan that envisions this over an extended period of time is critically important, and really, I think, operationalizes scenarios from which this may play out. So it's going to be a tremendous challenge, and it's one that's going to challenge the fundamental ideas of environmental regulation in many ways.
Well, that's certainly helpful, if daunting. In the context of Cape Ann, as you may know, 4 municipalities, a relationship to the state, in the context of 4 municipalities that have historically defined themselves in contrast to one another, while also being able to, collaborate on certain fronts. Are there precedents or models in the US for cross-governmental collaboration on planning for these types of events?
Yes and no. I mean, I think ultimately it depends on the relationship, delegated authority, home rule, who's really in charge at the end of the day. And you look at a state like California, which has a lot of sticks and carrots, and particularly a lot of carrots, the state really struggles to incentivize historically affordable development, but to incentivize the de-risking of housing and infrastructure development by counties in the name of sustainability, but also in the name of adaptation. So even in the sort of best case scenario politically and structurally, states really struggle to engage. And I think in Massachusetts, that struggle is a little bit different because there's a huge competition for resources, and the draw of Boston isn't appreciated in its kind of metropolitan manifestations, in the sense that Boston will be so much of a huge demands for capital infrastructure investment. The T alone, you may remember our work on the T and the capital investments from sea level rise in the T alone are such that the surrounding areas are going to pit themselves in political conflict for limited amounts of money. So to your question, no, there's not great examples out there. It's either a rather draconian using environmental laws to essentially, in the name of conservation, to essentially de-risk, or some types of incentive programs like they have in California, but those incentive programs are not always utilized because there's superior NIMBY politics at a local level.
Well, in a context like Cape Ann, where we know that housing access is already quite challenging, particularly for certain classes of individual, it's already a pressure. As you mentioned, the natural environment, that's the lure, the draw, the kind of meaning of the place historically, but also its economy. As those pressures are felt, Cape Ann is already housing challenged, is our observation. I'm interested in what you say about the notion of perverse incentives that are maladaptive. I thought, the example that you illustrated it with, which is, the bridge, the causeway that's engineered to 100 years by virtue of regulatory and policy frameworks and professional codes, and et cetera, in the context of a place which is going away or will migrate. That's something as a case study that's, I think, quite close to home for Cape Anners. We can see many examples of infrastructures that may want to be made more durable, elevated, rebuilt, redoubled. And we know, of course, the political class, political leadership are often, they have a shorter time frame of mandate. They're elected or appointed for a certain time of office. They, are looking at a certain time horizon for budgeting. So my sense from you, and knowing you and your work for some time, is you must have some empathy for the political appointed and elected leadership in these contexts that are struggling with those choices. What advice do you have, in those kinds of trade-offs between longer term infrastructure investments that we know may not be valuable in the long run?
I don't remember if you were there, Charles, but I remember there was a mayor of some small town in South Florida who said the true mark of climate leadership is letting people down in increments that they can absorb. And I think that transparency about the trade-offs of what you get and what you give up are really critically important. We're doing some work on carrying capacity now so that we can start to understand what is the upper thresholds of our carrying capacity and the decisions that we make today and the implications of that for tomorrow. And I think as we begin to utilize that tool and those sets of tools in the public process, whether it's budgeting or zoning, and we begin to understand the relationships, but also the scenarios and the uncertainties that we face, we can have more directed conversations that are better informed. And I think that's actually moving pretty quickly. There's one firm in particular that stands out that does public budgeting, and it's like a whole online interface that allows the public budgeting process to have a public engagement sort of tool, and you can sort of parametrically slide and see what the implications are, right? So if you increase to schools, what do you give up somewhere else in the budget, right? And it allows people to become more engaged. And I think that's fundamentally where we're going, particularly with climate services technologies, where we're going to have, I think, more and more tools to allow people to understand what we face and what we give up. For everything we gain, we're going to give something up in the trade-offs associated with these decisions. So I'm reasonably optimistic that science and applied science and design, fundamentally, these are design challenges, and how we communicate with people are going to help us get there, or help us get to a place where we feel like we have more informed decision making. But you know what? We'll never have perfect information. There will always be huge amounts of uncertainty and deep uncertainty and ignorance in the process. And we have to have a vision for what we want in the future. And there's no inescaping the value of consensus and the value of leading with a vision for a better tomorrow.
Let me turn to my colleague, Kira Klingent. Kira, you've been working on these topics for some time yourself. What are your thoughts here?
Jesse, thank you so much. I learned so much from your talk. I guess one question that I have that I think is related to federal cost shares and how they're not being waived for more under-resourced communities. The last time that we talked, we were talking a little bit about Gloucester, and it has a really large wastewater treatment plant. And you were talking a little bit about why those larger infrastructure upgrades are normally paired with development. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think to answer that, let me just highlight something that's I think is important to understand, which is the adaptation of development paradox, which is that because this is something that's coming up in our work just, in fact, today, municipalities often find themselves and in Miami is kind of a classic example of this, where they need to grow a tax base and grow and support development to pay for deferred maintenance and the capital expenses associated with new infrastructure. And they need that to grow the tax base so they can extract from that tax base the capital necessary to pay for adaptation. It's a paradox in the sense that there's no real end to it, right? You're building up this kind of house of cards because you're taking money from one development and you're paying for others in more distributive ways and hoping that you build more resilience or engineering resilience performance in those developments so they have lower cost functions. But at the end of the day, the interesting challenge is not how we build, but where we build. And I think people are just now coming to terms with that. We can't solve this with building code. We can't solve this with the quality of construction. It actually has everything to do with where we build and the land use components of it, which, by the way, from a climate mitigation and from a decarbonization element are just so absolutely critically important. Our colleague, Billy Fleming, has really thought about this a lot in landscape, for instance. So I'm not sure I totally answered your question, but to say that there is a paradox there, and that paradox means that you have to build to create to save what you have.
Absolutely. That makes sense. And so that kind of also translates into some communities that are finding kind of higher ground receiving areas right now and trying to buy those parcels or using municipally owned parcels that are at higher elevations to eventually relocate their tax base. It seems like all of those things are in the same.
That's right. And strategically, it's not about also where you invest, but where you strategically disinvest. And we've spent many years working with different governmental units to try to make those decisions. Like, okay, where are we not going to invest? Where do we begin to scale back our CapEx and our OpEx so that we can be in a better position to reallocate? In fact, this has come up with public housing. And those are just huge human costs, not just financial costs.
Absolutely. I think you touched a little bit, and I want to ask another question about climate education after this. But starting to kind of think about those trade-offs, there are these moments that are windows for risk-free education, and Massachusetts doesn't have any type of flood disclosure law, even though we have a couple of Senate bills right now that are trying to work toward that. Are there other moments that are kind of windows for flood risk disclosure other than when people are moving, because people often buy insurance when they're moving and then they never revisit those policies?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you could look at this. I think the disclosure is really about what happened in the past. So it's from one party moving on to the next party and an obligation essentially to tell. That's a little different from a kind of regularized update of of what forward-looking behavior is. So disclosure is about looking backwards. What I think you're talking about is looking forward, and renters as well as home buyers have that opportunity in the best bills and legislation in the country to look backwards and have an obligation. And that's a good thing. And Massachusetts, I'm sure, will get there one day. Looking forward is a little different. And the challenge there is we don't have great technology and science, and measurement science at this point to do anything other than a pretty rough reflection of what those risks could be differentiated among similarly situated geographies in and around you. We don't have lot by lot property assessment. It's not as precise as some people say that it is or project or sell you it as being. So I think as a forward-looking assessment, that's a real challenge, both for consumers, but also for the mortgage and the housing industry itself, is that what can we fundamentally rely on, And at this point in time, the best we can rely on is, has this property ever flooded or ever, I don't know, whatever disclosure mechanism you want to think about, had mold, for instance, which is probably a material consideration legally will be obliged to disclose anyway. But we're not there. I think in the next 5 years, though, that we will have the technology to have reasonably good property specific estimates of all the different types of flooding that can manifest.
And I guess to that end, could you explain a little bit more about kind of combined flood products and things that we're seeing in insurance markets right now? Yeah,
Massachusetts. So one of the things you're seeing in Massachusetts is historically you've got a property owner, you got property insurance, you get wind insurance, you get all these different lines of insurance separately, and private. And of course, you have the National Flood Insurance Program, but the National Flood Insurance is a relatively low coverage rate, right? And so for larger homes or jumbo size loans, value of asset, you need to go to the private market. And you set up all these conflicts where you have some flood loss and you have that impacts your home. And then the insurance companies kind of fight with each other, and there's like questions about deductibles, and it's like administratively a huge hassle, and people recognize this. So what we now see are combined products where flood is rolled into essentially a general property insurance product, so that you have one premium, one deductible. It's streamlined. You don't have to fight with multiple insurance carriers to get paid. So it's likely an interesting thing. It could work. It's hard to know how the market will respond, but that is a recent development, and there's got to be some demand for it if they're doing it.
Thanks, Jesse. We have some excellent questions in the Q&A chat. You should have at the bottom of your browser a Q&A function, so please put your questions there. So among those questions, if Cape Ann were to experience a significant tropical storm or hurricane with substantial damage to homes and infrastructure, would insurance payouts and any forms of federal disaster relief be sufficient to cover the costs of rebuilding?
Yeah, so if you had a subtropical event or confluence of events leading to a major set of losses, public assistance as currently structured today would really be pretty inadequate in terms of the total amount of losses. Even if you take, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and the enormous amount of capital that we spent and have been spending there, just structurally, there are going to be a lot of uninsured losses and a lot of uncovered losses that the federal government won't be able to pay for. And that's true for not just private interests and assets, but public infrastructure. So, the federal government is going to pay for the cleanup, and they'll give you money for cleanup, but other types of disaster public assistance for infrastructure are just inadequate to the total cost at the end of the day. And they don't account for life cycle effects on other, degraded infrastructure. I mean, it's really about a kind of loss and damage orientation. So the bottom line is that there's a tremendous inadequacy. And historically, smaller communities used to kind of what they used to do is they kind of, particularly in the Southeast, they knew that they had an asset that was on the edge of its useful life. And they would kind of wait for a big storm to come because they knew the federal government would give them money and they would use that to replace it, essentially that same level of service. That model's pretty much over. Federal governments and Congress have kind of moved beyond that. They know that people do that. And as a consequence, I think there's more flexibility in how you spend the money with Section 428, for instance. But at the end of the day, which is an alternative procedure for public assistance. But at the end of the day, these dollars amounts are up to Congress, and it's red state, blue state, and it's all politics. And even if you got all the money that you wanted, you're still not going to have enough to cover your losses.
And a related follow-up, in the wake of a storm event, in the context of, New England, Massachusetts, Cape Ann, we've acknowledged that this is not a culture that's likely to be managed in any form of adaptation or retreat. Right? It has a long tradition of, self-determinization at a variety of levels. Can you say something about the federalization of Cape Ann in the wake of a storm event? The way that the Corps will come in and tend to operationalize in the wake of an event. I know in many contexts, certainly in our experience in South Florida, having a plan on the shelf at that point was seen to be desirable. But can you say something about that notion of the federal government kind of intervening and superseding local governance?
Yeah, I mean, really, that's pretty limited. I mean, where there are federal assets, Coast Guard, General Services Administration, Department of Defense, Commerce or DHS with a Coast Guard base, I should say. There's federal assets, and they're going to have the federal government's going to engage in what it is. The Army Corps of Engineers doesn't play a particularly big role in conflict of interest and full acknowledgement. And I'm speaking in my individual academic capacity today, but I also serve in a different capacity with a different hat on for the Army Corps of Engineers and economists. But you said something very important that's worth highlighting, which is the idea of the kind of off-the-shelf plan, what comes next. And you need to know what to ask for when it comes time to ask for things. And I think when the federal government, they get a lot of money thrown at them and they struggle to get that money. I mean, they're struggling to get money out for IRA right now, right? There's just billions and billions of dollars and there's not enough people holding their hands up. So in the event of a singular disaster, and again, it's a little dangerous to think about climate change as a series of like intervening disasters, because there's chronic stress and shock, and it's the interaction of the shock and the stress that's probably the most difficult nut to crack, and probably the most important one that brings us here today. But with that being said, having an off-the-shelf post-disaster recovery plan that is integrated with climate considerations in the long haul, like what do we do next, and having that ready to go is a really, really important thing to have. And the federal government really likes to see that, because it makes their jobs easier when there's some thinking, a forethought about what do we do next. It's something that's really, really critical.
Thanks for that. Another question in the
just one second, going back to
Please.
that for 1 second. Just as an example, Tampa Bay has this wonderful plan from like 10 years ago where they like go through this scenario of like a category 5. And you may remember Hurricane Ian almost took out Tampa this year, but for this last minute curve. And their plan for the movement of Tampa is to move it to higher ground and to completely move downtown and much of the area up to the northeast, essentially. And it's a kind of unbelievable, like no one ever looks at it, but yeah, they got together and they're like, we're going to move Tampa, even if it's just a few miles or feet or whatever, you know, it's a big deal. And there's other jurisdictions out there that have that. So sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Thanks for that. That's a really helpful precedent. Another question from the Q&A, sort of two-parter. So one is, you know, a pushback on the notion of, you know, are the wealthy individuals and institutions really already adapting or simply better able to self-insure against risk? And then, you know, how does that correlate to the availability of information? Your comments today have suggested that the best information is held in a proprietary form and is not made public. And how do we understand that relative to what's made available publicly?
So I'm sorry, the question is about, can you restate the question again? Just, I'm trying to think about the risks and the information.
Yeah, so you made the claim, and I've reinforced it for my own sense, that individuals and institutions are already adapting.
Yeah.
And the pushback is, well, are they simply just able to take risk on by virtue of their wealth? So what actions are they taking? You know, I mean, you've already suggested with respect to markets and municipal, you know, bonds, et cetera, but say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth recognizing that everyone adapts. It's just the depth, the robustness, the quality, the fairness of that adaptation is uneven and is resource dependent. But it doesn't mean that people who are highly vulnerable or under-resourced aren't adapting, because indeed that's the nature of civilization and human learning over really hundreds of thousands of years, from which we've had even previous climate changes. So we know this in anthropology, we know this in a lot of other fields. So I don't want to leave the impression that people aren't adapting, right? Because they are in very small ways. And we already adapt in ways that we don't even fully probably appreciate in our own behaviors.
Yeah. I put in the chat function earlier the NOAA sea level rise viewer that you referenced, as well as a particular pen referencing Cape Ann. So that's a resource that's available publicly. Is it fair to assume that the proprietary, the private information is better than the information that's made available publicly?
Gosh, that's such a great question. It's not the information, it's not a product, it's a service. And what's actually happening is that most of the data is coming from public investments in government satellites and government data, and it's being repurposed and reapplied to solve bespoke problems and solutions to address this problem. Maybe not solutions, but information that's structured in a way that addresses it. So the data itself is almost universally the same data. Sometimes there's models that are unique and there's proprietary models, and yeah, it does produce different data, right? And there are some products out there, but for the most part, what's happening is it's services. It's how people apply it. And so in that sense, we all have individual, it's like going to a doctor, right? It's like going to a general practitioner who versus going to a specialist. And everybody else in the private market is getting to go to specialists and endocrinologists and surgeons and all this other stuff. And we're stuck with just going to a general family practice practitioner, right? And
Well,
so that's
earlier you had us going to CVS to stitch ourselves up
stitch
on our dining
ourselves
room
up. That's
table.
right.
So
I mean,
yeah, I
that's
think I like the through line, obviously the medicinal habit of mind. There's a question here about the relative threat of your municipality's bond rating being a kind of weak signal vis-a-vis expenditures for adaptation, and how might we think about that incentive, let's say, versus the loss of the actual tax base itself. Is there any
yeah.
distinction to be made there?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same thing in the sense that there are scenarios from which credit costs and credit availability, but really costs, go up. And it may not necessarily have anything to do with the loss of a tax base. It may be it may be an outcome of institutional failure to account and plan and prepare. Right. And in many ways that we're kind of seeing that. So you can shoot yourself in your foot just by not being prepared or answering the questions or thinking it through. It's going to require asset management systems and systems of disclosure and accounting that are going to really measure how, through the shock and stress of climate, it is impacting our assets, impacting our revenue, impacting our expenditures. And you're really going to have to create those. In fact, you mentioned earlier in my book, Climate Adaptation, Finance and Investment in California, which thanks to the Federal Reserve is free on the public. You can download a copy of the book for free online. They bought the copyright to it. And in there, I talk a lot about what local governments need to do to create these essentially asset management systems to have transparency. Now, the downside is the more you disclose and the more you go down that route, the more vulnerable and the more people can pick apart what your underlying risks and uncertainties are. But it's the direction that we more or less have to have. And so I bring that up because by not going in that direction, you can be penalized even if you don't have a lot of physical exposure. You may have some concentrated physical exposure. So there's not necessarily parity between those things.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Federal Reserve, and one of our guests has asked, what role, if any, do you see the Federal Reserve in addressing some of these issues? And is there any comparison available to the role of central banks in Europe, for example?
Well, I just said the Federal Reserve. I should have been more precise. Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco was generous in supporting that publication. The Federal Reserve System is part of the NGFS, which is the acronym escapes me all of a sudden, or the full title, but it is essentially a group of central banks that have all gotten together to essentially begin the process of articulating systems for the greening and browning of assets and capital allocations and risk standards and stress testing and the whole lot. So central banks are working quite collaboratively to bring order to this, to standardize a kind of data ontology, to begin to think about what a stress test or a climate stress test would look like, to begin thinking about scenario planning. What does it mean? How much, if an asset is truly a brown asset, like what would that really mean in terms of capital allocations or set asides or risk? And so it's I would say a very early stage, but it's one that's advanced nonetheless in a lot of different areas. And these are the leading central banks of the world, including the United States. So it's an important thing to follow because it will dictate the flow of capital. And again, central banks and the current Federal Reserve chair has been very clear about this. They're not in a position, particularly in the United States, to make and create policy, right? They're not out there to decarbonize. That's not their role, nor should it be. Their role is to stabilize employment, stabilize inflation. These are statutory obligations. And in doing so, you have to understand the material risks of climate change, right? And so you have to draw that very, very important distinction. They're not there to shift and tell you where the capital should go. They're there to understand where risk and material risk manifests itself and how you should, in terms of prudential regulation, have oversight over that. And that's a very important distinction.
A very particular case on Cape Ann is the case of publicly owned land, in this case, town-owned, municipally owned land that's leased over a long term, let's say a century, to homeowners that own their houses atop, and often in quite extraordinary condition with respect to infrastructure, the migration of natural resources and the like. So are there any national cases or precedents there that might be relevant?
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of long-term ground leases. Well, Water Street and much of the skyscrapers in Lower Manhattan are on long-term ground leases, and those ground leases are nearing the end of their term. I think in the next decade or so, and it's really interesting about there's more questions than there are answers in terms of what are the implications of that, of the ground leaseor, and what are their obligations for infrastructure and to maintain. What happens in that land is inundated, or is it no longer useful? I don't have a good response to that. But I can say that this has come up in a couple of different places in New York and Florida and California, and it's a very wicked problem. And in fact, it's such a wicked problem that I can say that lenders are willing to just walk away from those things. It's not something that they want to be engaged in. So again, private market actors often sort of dictate what your options are. And I can tell you lenders, I've talked to some lenders actually about that that situation in Manhattan, and they just don't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah, it's a particular challenge based on the conversations we've been having on Cape Ann. There are some real challenging kind of wicked problems with respect to publicly owned land and infrastructure supporting, private residents, and tough choices along different timelines, different incentives. So we are coming up to the close of our time. I want to end with a kind of big question that's in the Q&A, which is, if you, Jesse, were appointed, I tell you I don't have the power to do this, but if in the fullness of time you were to be appointed a benevolent climate adaptation czar for the 4 Cape Ann communities, what are the top 3 actions that you would take to prepare Cape Ann financially?
I think it's really about developing these asset management systems, understanding what you have. I would venture to say most of these jurisdictions really don't have a full sense of what they have and are fully responsible for. They're going year to year budget allocations. I'm sure there are CapEx plans and capital plans, but those are mostly keeping the ship afloat, as most jurisdictions and local governments are in the United States. And the next and very first step is to align those capital plans with a long-term spatial plan that incorporates some rather difficult conversations about the climate impacts and the limitations on land and infrastructure and what those costs are, so that they can plan and prepare for that. That's the single most important thing that you can do, is integrate capital and spatial planning. In fact, San Francisco built this in. The chief resilience, Brian Strong, I think is still the chief resilience officer of the city and county of San Francisco, is also head of capital planning. It's an ideal situation of what you want. So that needs to happen. The second thing is to really, as I mentioned, having tools and having conversations like this are critically important for informing people and to play out and understand the latent preferences of what people want to do and what they think is the right thing to do, and cultivate that conversation as we are today. That's a really important thing, because ultimately people are going to have to make decisions about what to protect and what to let go. I get 2 more things. The third thing is, I think having a public information, extending that to a public information plan that engages people in somewhere between disclosure and vision state, right? Not as a measure of propaganda, but as a way to engage people and also inform them. I always loved like how in Japan, how they took tsunami risk zones, and it was part of the landscape, it was part of the signage, it was part of like your orientation for wayfinding, and have that conversation play out in all of its artistic and public communications forms, I think is a part of the design mobilization. And finally, it's going to be necessary, I think, to engage with federal partners and to begin to have some more concrete plans where we can have post-disaster, we can have the chronic stress, we can begin to integrate multiple sectors that require multiple stakeholders. And certainly Engaging the state government is key, but also engaging multiple federal partners that can support that, because there's a lot of money out there now for technical assistance that can help bring the stakeholders to the table around something that looks and feels a little bit more objective about what the parameters of what the future may look like. And that's an immediate next step. But this is all politics at the end of the day. And again, I've said this for many years. People have to make a decision about what to protect and what to let go. And there's no substitute for the conversations that we're having today.
I'll take that as a non-denial for your availability for the role. Kira, let me give you the last word.
Jesse, thank you so much. That's a really great call to action to get to work. And I just want to plug in the chat, we have Jesse's website and also a link to his free book, Managing Climate Risk in the United States Financial System. Jesse, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Keenan. Thank you, Kira Kleen. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Joining us in the fall. We'll be in your feeds for conversations on preparing for disaster and how we talk about climate adaptation. Stay well.